Arthas Menethil, the Lich King, and one of the most iconic characters in gaming, was recently brought back in the Shadowlands expansion for a second conclusion to his story. This was done so abysmally poorly that it not only ruined his character, but retroactively made his first death far worse. This got me thinking, however, about another character who was brought back from the dead to serve the narrative once more. Now, as you might have guessed by the thumbnail, that is Emmett Selk of Final Fantasy XIV fame. Well, at this stage, FF's narrative dominance over World of Warcraft is well recorded, but today I want to compare the stories of both these characters, as there's actually a lot of parallels in the first part of their stories before their deaths, but then they wildly diverge when they're brought back. With Emmett, his second appearance gets a maybe even more satisfying conclusion than the first, while Arthas got absolutely massacred. So without much preamble, let's begin with the similarities between these two characters. Both of them were leaders of their people. They were incredibly important to the overall plot, as well as very present within them. In their own rights, they were very powerful characters, with one being able to orchestrate the destruction of worlds, and the other commanding legions of undead with a mere thought. Then lastly, and most interestingly in my opinion, is they both had the same narrative archetype, that being the road to hell paved with good intentions. Arthas was a young idealistic prince and paladin who, through his desire to protect his people, was led down the path of selling his soul for the power to get revenge on the one who was threatening them, in the process becoming the Lich King and shifting that desire from protecting his people in life, protecting them in undeath. Emmett Selk is a member of the Convocation of 14, and an unparalleled mage who has a similar desire to protect his people. This led him to eventually make the decision to summon Zodiac to forestall the final days, which required the sacrifice of more than half the surviving population. After this, when Zodiac was shattered by the rival god Hydaelyn, he went on to orchestrate the destruction of world after world in the hopes of piecing Zodiac back together, despite each world teeming with sentient life. They are villains, an existential threat to our existence, and us as the player having to kill them is a necessity for our continued survival. But even though we're justified, we can still empathize with these two characters. The decision they made were fair. They chose lesser evils and ended up doing greater and greater ones, as they'd already chosen that course. Ultimately, at the time we face and defeat them, they were both great characters in both stories. I still go back and watch the death of Arthas. I feel bad for him as he reconciles with his father before seeing the hellish darkness of the afterlife claim him for his crimes. Emmett Selk's final moments of understanding that time moves on and that you're a worthy successor to remember them still almost brings a manly tear to my eye. Their deaths were sad and dignified. They both got a complete finale. Now we get to the depressing part. Arthas' first death was in Wrath of the Lich King, and he doesn't make an appearance again until Shadowlands, 5 expansions or more than a decade later. Although saying he makes an appearance might be a bit of a stretch, as the sum total of him as his own character coming onto our screens, not like a flashback, not like an illusion, but actually Arthas Menethil himself, is 30 seconds of him being a wisp. His soul did go to hell, but then was put into a sword that mind-controlled another character, and when that sword was broken, all was left was this used and abused remnants of his soul. No face, no real appearance, no words or anything. One of the most iconic villains in all of World of Warcraft, who was shown pretty heavily in the promotional material for Shadowlands, mind you, got 30 seconds of a floating orb we're told is Arthas. He's brought back as a narrative device to let Sylvanas talk shit. This is despite us learning that all the terrible things Arthas did was because he was effectively being mind-controlled the entire time, so that we were primed for some kind of redemption arc for him, especially when you have Sylvanas talking about how much better she is despite him being forced to commit atrocities. She committed genocide, killed her own troops, started a world war to deliberately send souls to hell, all voluntarily, and then trash talks Arthas, who didn't have much control over his actions. Bringing a character back is a serious thing. Bringing them back for a 30-second cameo as a narrative device for a character that 90% of people hate and retroactively ruining all of that character's lore is not the way to do it, unsurprisingly. So, how do you bring back a character in a satisfying way? Well, unsurprisingly, the Final Fantasy XIV writers show us a masterclass with Emmett Selk. The first major factor is that he returns to the expansion after his death. There isn't any real disconnect between his two stories, as they both flow nicely into each other. The second is that we don't just pick up from him returning from the dead. His first appearance in Endwalker comes when we go back in time to before the final days to meet him before he becomes a villain. This doesn't just continue his story, but starts to build a new narrative that also helps us to fill in gaps and gives us further context to the first story that already concluded. By the end, where he's getting his memory wiped, he tells us to not waste the legacy that he's left you, just as he asked you not to forget the legacy of the Ascians upon his death in Shadowbringers. His motivations are consistent, his attitude makes sense, but now, after this sequence, we have an even deeper appreciation for his character. This ultimately culminates in his return at the edge of the universe as a kind of force ghost helping the player one last time to reach their goal. It's redemptive in a way to see him giving that last push to defeat the bringer of the final days, just as he's tried to do so long with the summoning of Zodiac. Then the true icing on the cake is that he shows his acceptance as you as an equal in your role as a Dem, which is a plot point onto itself, by entrusting you with one last task. He embraces your role as the Traveler, listing off all the places on Eorzea you still haven't visited. It's such an interesting moment looking back, as ultimately there's this hype about finishing the fight and finally getting to relax, but also getting basically all the plot points for the future. He does also give room for returning as a Force Ghost in future, but I'll be interested to see if they actually do so. So to conclude, how should you bring back a character after their death? First, you plan it out so it's relatively close to the first death, so you don't lose narrative cohesion. Secondly, you have them return as a character in their own right in a way that is recognizable as them. Thirdly, you build a new story where that character is in it, not as a narrative device for someone else. And then lastly, you have to have a second conclusion which fits into the story. You're not bringing back someone just because you wanted to bring back a hyped character for the sake of it. You really need them for the story to work. All four of these points require one big thing, however, and that's planning. Time and time again, we see Final Fantasy XIV more broadly blow World of Warcraft out of the water on a narrative level, and this comes down entirely to their ability to sit down and plan out their story. We recently saw a live letter where they announced another 10 years of Final Fantasy XIV, starting with us following Emmett Selk's advice and starting to travel the world once more. I'm confident that the narrative in FF is going to continue to be incredible and worth every dollar that I put into it. On the flip side, I'm also confident that World of Warcraft's laissez-faire approach to story will continue making nothing but rage-bait cinematics in the upcoming expansions. If you've made it to this end, thank you for watching this organized rant. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you enjoy video essay style content, even if sometimes it gets more passionate than rational, like, subscribe, and have an excellent day.